All right, we begin the semester with a lecture on it's called Encounter and Renaissances: Rise of the Modern World. And I like to start with the Renaissance because I do think it does set up so much of what happens in the history afterwards. And I did call it Renaissances basically because, in some ways, I do believe there is a unique Renaissance. Um, but I also believe that its uniqueness is temporal. In other words, what is produced during this time period in the Italian city states is something that doesn't just come out of thin air, but that it comes from movements all across not just Europe, in particular Italy or the Italian states, but it comes from the Eastern world in specific. So that's what they will look at. And when we're talking about Renaissance, we're talking about rebirth. We're talking about um, the realization and the rediscovery for the Western Europeans in particular of the ancient Greek and Roman social cultural world and intellectual world. And so what you're seeing is a lot more development in especially art, utilizing what they're going to see as Greek and Greco-Roman idealism and in some ways pre-Christian idealism. So there's a lot about rethinking what it means to be a human being, what it means to actually do science. These are things that the Renaissance kind of gets going. Um, and I do think there's a dark side of the Renaissance because I believe, and this will be the second part of the lecture that accompanies this one, it happens to correspond to the time period where Western Europeans are going to start encountering the so-called other. And what I mean by that is, think the Renaissance is usually dated around the beginning of the 14th century, maybe a little bit earlier. Usually, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy is kind of the starting point, and the end is somewhere probably in the early, very early 16th century, right around time period where periodization of the Reformation begins. And there is no Reformation without the Renaissance. But I think there's a dark side because, in a lot of ways, what happens is this European human being that's being rethought is now encountering others across the globe in a way more dynamic way than ever before. I mean, there is the initial encounter with the East that happens with the Crusades, and that's an 11th century. That's where that begins. But now you have not just trade happening in the Indian Ocean, so Europeans going into Asia, but also the beginning of the slave trade happens on the especially on the west coast of Africa, and probably most importantly is the discovery by Columbus in 1492 of what the Europeans will call the New World, and that becomes the America. So you have, which is going to obviously affect the way that there's encounters with people in Asia and people in Africa. So this all kind of gets the ball rolling, and I think you really have to understand what's going on internally in Europe to understand what they do externally outside its borders to the other. And it is something that Western Europeans are doing the thinking of themselves, as you can see in Shakespeare's play *The Tempest*, which is really kind of a weird play. If you ever read it before, it doesn't really seem like a Shakespeare play, but I think you do see this kind of image happening here, where you have the um, Western European man represented by Prospero protecting his daughter, and then you have the kind of barbaric, savage, animal, half man, Caliban. And so I think the background of the play is where they kind of stumble upon this uninhabited island of sorts. So it does, 100 years after Columbus, historians try to see like the link and try reading this the way West Europeans thought about themselves as opposed to other people. And not too long after Columbus' discovery, you get images like this of Amerigo Vespucci encountering America, and here America stands for her nakedness, right? She's kind of laid bare and open. There's like a cannibalism going on in the background here. There's wild animals behind her in the forest. And then you see behind him, he's holding tools of science and tools of exploration, this ship. So you kind of have this image of like civilized versus, uncivilized, and this is kind of a common theme throughout the history we're going to look at. This is something hundreds of years later, late 19th century. This image here, doesn't there's no subtlety here. You have the Western Europeans, entering Africa, bringing civilization, and then you have the barbaric horde back here. So, as I mentioned, that's why I think the Renaissance is important, because it kind of sets the stage for these different types of encounters where Western Europeans are kind of in this moment of new self-awareness and definition, and then in contrast to that, they are seeing the others, whether it's indigenous others in the Americas, or the Asian and African otherness across the world. And I honestly think this relationship gets worse over time when you start bringing like the dimensions of race in it. So just something, again, you don't really need to know now, but it's something to kind of keep an eye on as we move ahead. All right, so I'm going to go through this slide relatively quickly, because I've kind of said enough already. But you read through the chapter on Renaissance, you know that urbanization helps a lot for the Renaissance, what we call the Renaissance, to kind of explode in the certain Italian city-states. Much of this has to do with the position of Italy, or yeah, the nation state Italy, which wasn't known as Italy back here, but um, its connection to the Mediterranean, to trade, allows it to bring in information from the Eastern world. And I mean, Eastern world, we're talking the Islamic world, the Chinese world, and even the Indian world of this time period. So you're getting information in, and that is really helping explode a cultural contact that will allow, just this flurry of art and literature to come out of Italy. And we'll see there's one place in particular it flows up into. All right. Now, I have a list of themes here. You should probably write this down and know these. But they kind of explain themselves, so I'm not going to really go into them very much. It's just to say that um, the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and literature really does help the imagination of early modern Western Italian, specifically Italian artists and thinkers, and then it'll continue to flow out of that setting. There's a new attention to this world. I think when you look at the themes of like individualism, secularism, humanism, and historical consciousness, these are themes of this world. And so there's a lot more attention on how to live in this world, how to study this world, how to represent this world. The fact that this is going on in Italian states leads to it to go back to Rome as ancestors on how to do politics again and stuff like that. Um, so this is why the Renaissance happens here, and it in some ways, as the previous slide said, this is kind of the origin point, right? The Renaissance, the origin point of modernity. And don't get yourself wrapped up in that term modernity. Is something will develop over time. But I do think the Renaissance is that origin point for Western Europeans to kind of um, contemplate life and think of themselves on the global stage. And philosophy and science, study of science, will be the big one. That's why there's, it's also connected to the humanities, literature, philosophy, study religion. They're all things that are really going to matter to the historical or to this time period. And you kind of breaking out of that kind of collective collective understanding of humanity that you see in medieval Christianity in particular. There's Renaissance individualism as kind of idealized in Michelangelo's David, which I have a video in the module about. All right. We're going to look at the discovery aspect of this later, but kind of want to wrap up the intellectual side of the Renaissance, and then we'll talk about the exploration side in another lecture. But the Renaissance does flow up into the Northern European, Western European world, particularly England. And so figures like Sir Thomas More and Desiderius Erasmus were both Renaissance writers who are also critics of what they saw as the ignorance within the Catholic or the medieval church, medieval Christian church. The discovery of the printing press is a major media revolution. It's probably one of the biggest revolutions in media in human history, because now you can write books, you can mass produce them, and they can get out. More people can read them. The problem is most Western European people couldn't read; they weren't literate. So part of the program of More and Erasmus was that they wanted to see more of the average European being able to be literate. This includes women. Both More and Erasmus. More had a daughter who is apparently brilliant, and Erasmus wrote about this much as well. And so it's pretty forward thinking for their time. Moore's probably most famous for two things. He writes a book called Utopia, which is basically written about a decade or so after Columbus, and he posits this idea of basically a utopian island where people are living with things in common and there's kind of peace and happiness there. The other thing he's most famous for is having his being beheaded because he didn't go along with King Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. More of that later. Erasmus is famous for being a satirist. He would make fun of the ignorance of the church by writing satires about it. Very much, going back to ancient Greek and Roman satire writers. So you can see the Renaissance really flowing in Erasmus's veins. But his biggest contribution is in the interpretations and editing of ancient Christian writings and ancient Greco-Roman writings. And so this kind of lays out a foundation for other future thinkers to develop both philosophical and theological thought. Finally, for the Renaissance, in the realm of social political thinkers, the biggest name here is Machiavelli, who you're reading this week. And Machiavelli was someone who some consider the first real modern political philosopher. And to boil Machiavelli down in a nutshell is to kind of say that he basically thinks about politics in a utilization what's called political realism or realpolitik. He asked, how do you actually run politics? Not in this kind of platonic ideal, but in a sense of look, if you're a ruler, how do you stay in power? How do you maintain your power without being assassinated? Because even himself, as a diplomat, he was on the wrong side of a quarrel with regards to regime change, imprisoned and tortured in 1513. So this is somebody who saw the ups and downs of the Italian political world. And so he, most famously, he did write about Republican-style government based on ancient Rome. But his most famous work is The Prince. And in The Prince, he writes about this kind of, idea: is it better to be feared or loved for the political ruler? And what he does is basically argues that, hey, you do whatever you do, you do what it takes to stay in power. And that means even coercing and lying and cheating and stealing. If that you have to do that to stay in political power, then you do it. And so, as I mentioned, some people say, Machiavelli is kind of moving away from any type of Christian moralism, dictating how his political philosophy should work, and basically saying look, it's a dog eat dog world and you got to survive.